Good afternoon, everybody. Robert Chinante. I'm the president here at South Shore Conservatory, and I am so excited to welcome you here today for Off Air. This is a format that we've been wanting to get off the ground for a little while, bringing us all together for music and friends and food. And speaking of friends, two people that I am so excited to present to you in just a little while. One of them is Joe Collymore, who is someone that you've probably gotten to know a little bit over the last couple of years through the work that he has done with South Shore Conservatory, with things like our Evenings Under the Stars series, most recently this summer as the narrator for Peter Boyer's program that we did as part of the Evenings Under the Stars opening, piece that sort of reflected on the Kennedy brother legacy, and also joining Ed on stage and some other faculty for a jazz concert that we did. Joe is no stranger to the South Shore, and he does work with our friends at Harbor Media, who are here today filming, so we'll be excited to share this with you again at some point. And I am really excited. Somebody I've been wanting to work with, Ron, we've been in touch on and off for about 7 years or so, and we finally are able to work together. Ron is a name, a voice that you probably all recognize. He has been the voice that has taken us through so many Boston Symphony Orchestra concerts, and that, you know, I was thinking about it, the music is such a big part of the experience when you listen, but Ron really helps to enhance that. He really takes you through a performance in a way that I don't think anyone else does, and you had a remarkable career on WGBH, WCRB from more than 3 decades, and we can still hear you on WPLM with your Sinatra show, and just so excited to share a little bit about your career today and to have you here at South Shore Conservatory for this very special program. So thank you for being here.
Robert, thank you so much, and it is quite a pleasure and an honor to be here. Now, I want to frame this properly. This is not only an interview, but I also want this to be an interactive dialogue between you, our audience, and Ron. We're going to set aside some time for you to ask questions and give Ron an opportunity to answer. So I'm hoping to play a very minor role in facilitating this exchange. And in setting this up, I will read briefly a little bit about his background, but we're going to go deeper and give him an opportunity to really fill in the gaps, so to speak. Ron's a local boy. He grew up in Quincy, and for close to 4 decades, radio listeners in the Bay State have stopped the dial when encountering his smooth baritone voice on a host of stations, including WBUR, WBOS, WBCN, WGBH, and WPLM. I found out that he's a walking musical encyclopedia. He has thrilled thousands of listeners with a smorgasbord of shows, including Classics in the Morning, Morning Pro Musica, the groundbreaking and hugely popular Music America, the Jazz Songbook, and more recently, Strictly Sinatra. Ron has interviewed some of the greatest legends in the music industry, including Luciano Pavarotti, Placido Domingo, Dizzy Gillespie, Dave McKenna, Rosemary Clooney, Bobby Short, composers David Raksin and Andre Previn, and musical legend Tony Bennett. He recently retired as the host of Boston Symphony Orchestra in both Boston and Tanglewood. Together, he and his lovely wife, Joyce, who's a renowned chef herself, they host WGBH's Learning Tours, which takes place all over the world. Without further ado, let's welcome Ron Della Chiesa.
Excuse me, it's great to be here with all these wonderful people. And this is like a mini Tanglewood when I came in. What a glorious place this is. And you know, it's so nice when I came in to see all of these little kids, these little toddlers coming out of a music appreciation course, which we don't have anymore. And that's sadly missing, from our schools. That's the way I think a lot of us learned about music, is from listening to the radio and somebody who took us to a concert, somebody who introduced us to an opera. It starts at a very young age. And unfortunately, a lot of the schools in America don't look at music appreciation. They look at teaching kids how to play instruments, but what about listening to great music? And I'm very passionate about that, because I think the more kids listen at a young age and it gets into their DNA, even when they're 6 months old or a year old, they get it. And then if they get it early, it's easier to get them into it later, because they already know about it. They're already there, part of the way.
So Ron, tell us about your early days of listening to music. Share with us what it was like growing up in Quincy listening to music.
Well, first of all, there was the radio. You had such great programs to listen to. I think a lot of us here in this room remember the golden age of radio, when you'd go home and a certain time, turn on the radio. You would hear so many wonderful orchestras and big bands, classical music, comedy, drama. It was all there, and your imagination worked so well during that time, because you had to imagine what these people looked like, what the sets were like. You created the stories in your mind as they were acting them out for you. So I got captivated, and I really decided I would like to be inside that box, speaking out from that box. So I built myself a little miniature radio station in the attic. It didn't go anywhere. I was just talking to myself, basically. But what changed it all was when, for Christmas, my parents brought me a tape recorder. Now, I don't know if you remember reel-to-reel tape. So I plugged my microphone in. I didn't have a cardboard mic. Now I had a real mic. Hit the record button. Then I played it back, and I couldn't believe how terrible I sounded, especially my Boston accent. There's no R in New England. It does not exist. The letter R does not exist. And boy, did I hear that when I played the recorder back. Ma, where did you park the car? Did you open the door? Is Dad coming home yet? We're going to go to the park. So what I did was I made a list of all those problem words and began to play them back, record myself, and then play them back as they should be said. Park, not park. Father, not father. Door, not door. And I started to work on, trying to get rid of that Boston accent, because I knew I had to do that if I went into radio, because they did not want to hear people talking like that if they were talking in Los Angeles or Chicago or so forth. That accent is so unique. So that was the beginning of my love for radio. Listening, imitation, and then finally going out and getting a job.
And let's talk about some of the early jobs that you had. What was your first? And then also share with us how you got involved with the Boston Symphony Orchestra.
Well, my first radio job, I was going to Boston University School of Communication, which had a radio station there. It's called WBUR. And at that time, it was not run as a business, it's student operated. So I was on the radio there for the first time. I had my own little jazz show. And then from there, I graduated from BU and got a job at another station, WBOS. That's an interesting story, because how that happened is one day I was in the control room doing my little radio show for WBUR, which was a student-operated station, as I mentioned. And I looked through the glass. We all work in studios behind glass. And there was this man with horn-rimmed glasses standing behind the glass. And I noticed he was listening to me through the speakers, doing my show. So I left the studio, and he came out and he said, would you like to come work for a commercial station? And I said, absolutely. I said, I'm just a student here. And he said, well, why don't you come over and work for us? We've got an opening at night. And I said, well, where's the station? He said, it's right up the street from BU, WBOS. Great call letters, by the way, Boston. I went up to the station, and he introduced me around, and he said, okay, the show is 6 to midnight. And I said, so is it going to be my own show? He said, oh, no, not yet. You're going to work as an English host for all these different foreign language programs. I said, well, what are the shows? He said, the Italian hour, the Polish hour, the Greek hour, the music of the Near East. And I said, well, and what do you do here? And he said, well, my name is Arnie Ginsberg, and I do a show at night called The Night Train Show. You may remember Arnie Woo Woo Ginsberg? So that's how I started. Arnie hired me, gave me my first commercial job, and I stayed there for about 2 or 3 years, but I had wonderful stories because every one of these radio hosts, Alberto De Chilis of the Italian Hour, the Dimas Kakridis of the Greek Hour, Kanya Skolsky of the Polish Hour, I would come in and I would spin their records for him, and if they had commercials in English, I'd do the commercials in English, otherwise they'd do them in Polish or Greek or Italian or Arabic. I'll never forget one great story. Boston, George Kafalopoulos, who was the man who hosted the Greek Hour 5 nights a week, 8 to 9 a.m. before the Irish Hour, by the way. Imagine Ron Della Chiesa doing the Irish Hour. So, George Kafalopoulos was from Greece. He was an actor, an opera singer. He did it all. He was a wonderful character. He used to make all his money by doing funeral announcements on the air. And I would get the music out at the funeral, very soft, dirge-like music to play in the background as he read these funeral announcements, one after the other after the other. Seemed that every Greek who died lived in Lowell. Remember that? So he was on the air once doing his funeral announcement, talking about this man who died and so forth and so on, and the music was going in the background. And all of a sudden the phone rang. I picked up the phone. I said, hello, Boston Greek Hour. He said, tell Kafalopoulos I'm not dead yet. He had the wrong guy who was dead. No. He had to get on the air and apologize. But these are the kind of things that went wrong in live radio. So I had great memories of those years at WBOS. From there, I left WBOS and I went to WBCN, Boston Concert Radio, which became one of the leading rock stations in America in 1968 with the American Revolution, which is a movie out now about that, by the way. If you get a chance, you can see it. It's streaming online about how WBCN changed the world, changed music forever, because it came around at a period in American history where we were in a terrible time in this country. Assassinations, wars, Vietnam. These young people got on the air and they started breaking those barriers down, playing this kind of music. Anyway, I was there until 1968 because I was a classical music guy and I had no future there, so I went over to WGBH, and I guess the rest is what you were talking about. I stayed there for 40 years, and that worked out quite well. So that's how that whole transition happened, from the Boston Greek Hour to WBCN, to WGBH, to the Boston Symphony, to WPLM, to Strictly Sonata, all kind of morphed together.
Ron, you've touched on so many interesting things just in this short period. From a historical perspective, when did FM radio really take hold and serve as a very popular platform for jazz music?
Well, you know, FM radio was the creation of a Major Armstrong. He was a genius, radio genius. He decided that, you know, there was a better way to do broadcasting rather than AM, amplitude radio, frequency modulation radio. First of all, the signal was so much better than AM. The quality of the broadcasting. You could hear all the instruments in a symphony orchestra so much clearly. And there was no static whatsoever. So FM radio really did change radio forever in America, especially with classical music. Now you could hear broadcasts, excuse me, crystal clear on your FM radio, and then FM started to come in car radios. So we had this whole revolution in radio that really made FM radio the leading form of radio in America. And it is to this day. We still have AM, thousands and thousands of AM stations, but they're devoted mostly to news and not music. Music, for good reason, because of the quality, has taken over FM radio, particularly classical music. If you hear an orchestra, classical music on AM radio, it just doesn't sound the same. But when you turn to FM, you get that broad spectrum, and you get it in stereo, too. That was another big factor. So FM stereo changed broadcasting forever.
I have a question for you. You've met so many jazz musicians over your lifetime. If one were to say, who are the musicians that, in your opinion, serve as the Mount Rushmore of jazz, who would they be?
One certainly would be Louis Armstrong, a musician who I did not have a chance to interview. I would put Duke Ellington up there, Count Basie. As far as the American songbook, I would put up Frank Sinatra, of course, Tony Bennett. I would put up Ella Fitzgerald, Sarah Vaughan. For composers of the American songbook, I think Cole Porter, George Gershwin, Johnny Mercer, Jerome Kern. I mean, these are real giants. They belong there forever. And, you know, they changed music forever in America. If you listen to Louis Armstrong, just about every jazz musician who came after Louis was influenced by him because of his enormous ability not only to scat singing, but to tell a story when he sang. You know, when you heard Louis do the Basin Street Blues, you were there on Basin Street. The same true with Frank Sinatra, who developed a whole other vocal style emulated by just about every other singer who followed Frank. And Tony Bennett, of course, followed in his footsteps. So you have this marvelous evolution, as we do in classical music, you know, with Bach, Beethoven, Brahms, and also in opera with Puccini, Verdi, Donizetti, Rossini. We all evolve into what these great art forms became. So it's a continuum of the greats to the new young musicians who are studying today.
When we look at the technology of music, and I'm going to date myself now because I remember listening to some of my parents' music collections that were on 78s, which were lousy. The audio quality wasn't as good as when you got to the 33 RPMs. And so share with us your viewpoint on that evolution of the technology to the LP, if you will.
Yeah, that's a good story. My father had a collection of 78s, and he would play them endlessly. Caruso, all the great tenors. When the LP was created in 1948 by Columbia, CBS, that changed listening forever, because from getting three minutes of music on one side of a 78, if you flipped it over, you could put another 3 minutes on. Now the long-playing record, developed by Columbia Records in 1948, made it possible to put a complete opera or a complete symphony on one LP, one disc. So you take both sides of that disc, you could put a half hour on one side, a half hour on the other side. Now, complete opera takes about 3 hours, sometimes 4 hours. You can imagine on 78s how bulky those things were to carry around. And also they were fragile. If you dropped them, they would shatter in a million pieces. With the LP, you could now put a complete opera on one or maybe two LPs, or maybe three with the longer ones. 45 RPMs came out at the same time. They tried to compete with the LP, but they couldn't do it because you could only get 3 minutes on one side, 3 minutes on the other. So there's the big battle of the speeds, 33, 1 out.
Let's shift gears a little bit, and then we're going to open it up to our audience to ask questions as well. Let's talk about some of the popular venues for jazz music here in not just Massachusetts, but in New England.
Yeah. Well, we used to have many more jazz clubs. In Boston, we had, we had Storyville, we had the Jazz Workshop, we had the Hi-Hat. A lot of these great clubs, and they closed down because it was very unprofitable to open a jazz club in terms of audiences. And the rock generation really did a number on it too. When rock and roll came in, a lot of jazz musicians couldn't find work. So the jazz clubs were really struggling, So what happened was we morphed into jazz festivals. George Wein, who was from Providence, he founded the Great Newport Jazz Festival, which was one of the first jazz festivals of its kind in the world. The jazz clubs, when back in the 40s and 50s, were really thriving because during those years we had so many jazz giants who were playing and needed places to showcase their talent. So in Boston, it was a great, great jazz city. We had the Jazz Workshop, as I mentioned, Storyville, the Hi-Hat, the Pioneer Club, Mosley's. All of these great clubs, you could hear jazz every night of the week and go out and listen to it until 2 in the morning. So Boston was a great swinging jazz town. Now in Boston, we only have one jazz club. It's called Sculler's Jazz Club, and it's not really in Boston. You have to go out to Brighton to hear it. But you know, there's revivals of jazz everywhere now, particularly in the schools have great jazz programs. I know you have a great jazz program here, which is exciting. New England Conservatory, Berklee College of Music. So jazz will never die, it'll always be around, but unfortunately it won't achieve the status of rock music, which is such a multi-billion-dollar industry, you know. And that's the same problem with all of the musicians who play this music. It's hard to find gigs, and they're always out looking for them. So always support places that are playing live music, or even if you hear live jazz in a restaurant, tell them you enjoy what you're hearing. That's a way to perpetuate the music.
That's a good point. Please. You know, on a local level, I was very fond when I first returned to this area here to go into Tosca's and find in the Oak Room there where they had a jazz quartet playing there on occasion, and that was enjoyable. Ron and I share another point of intersection. Our dear friend John Chan,
Yes.
who owns a very famous jazz supper club.
Egg rolls and jazz. That's what he calls it.
Chan's Egg Rolls and Jazz in Woonsocket, Rhode Island. Yes. You want to share some stories about?
Well, John Chan is a fascinating guy. He loves the music, and that's the great. If you have an owner of a restaurant or a club who loves the music and it's inbred into that person's soul, he's going to be the one who'll want to make his room into a jazz room. Most of these club owners, most of these restaurant owners have no idea who Louis Armstrong is or Duke Ellington or Count Basie. But if they love the music, they're going to be dedicated to it, and that's exactly what John did. John loved this music, and he said, I'm going to turn my Chinese restaurant into a jazz club. So he called me one day years ago, and he said, what do you think we should call it? And I said, how about Egg Rolls and Jazz? Man, he really flipped. He loved that. And he's been doing it now for about 35 years. Dizzy Gillespie played there, Scott Hamilton's played there. All of these jazz greats, Dave McKenna, Dick Johnson, they all love playing at John Chan's. But it takes that kind of person who loves something in their soul to perpetuate it in a kind of a financial way too, because it costs him money to pay these jazz guys to play there. But he's got a winning jazz club, and he'll continue to do so as long as he keeps Egg Rolls and Jazz going. It's great.
He recently got an award from the Rhode Island State Cultural of the Arts in which to perhaps create a portion of his restaurant into a museum for memorializing some of these great jazz performances there.
Right.
Good stuff there. Now, let's open this up. So I'm going to get up out of my chair. Ron's going to continue to stay.
He's going to be Phil Donahue. Remember Phil Donahue? He pioneered that whole thing. We haven't talked about opera yet, which is one of my true loves. So if you want to talk about opera at any time, or singers, I'm open here. Usually I have to ask the questions. This is a joy for me to be on this end, believe me. Ask me anything you want.
Why don't we talk about opera then?
Yeah. Go ahead, Robert.
No, you should.
No, I mean, this is a reversal. So I've done that all the time. So you asked me about opera.
Why don't you talk a little about, we've spoke about sort of the tradition of opera in Boston and Sarah Caldwell and just sort of that whole evolution up to Boston Lyric Opera now, but also these many small companies that are thriving and presenting interesting operas. So maybe you could talk a little bit about just how opera in Boston has changed and maybe a favorite memory of Sarah Caldwell, because she was something else.
She was something else. But the Metropolitan Opera, as you know, the world's greatest opera company in New York, think of this, they do 26 productions of opera a year, 26 opera productions a year, 6 new opera productions. Every time that curtain goes up, it costs $2 million, $3 million. So you can imagine what they have done in their history through the years, going back to 1883, when the first opera was presented by the Met. They used to come to Boston on a tour every year. They'd bring the entire company to Boston. We didn't have an opera company until Sarah Caldwell, as Robert mentioned, came along and created the Boston Opera Company. She was a great innovator and a woman. Unusual to have a woman as the impresario, the head of a company, and a conductor. She was the first conductor to conduct at the Met. She did some of the most innovative opera productions in the world. People from all over the world used to come to Boston to hear Sarah Caldwell, and she introduced many young singers who went on to become superstars with her company, like Beverly Sills, Placido Domingo. They all sang with Sarah's company before they went to the Met. So she was a great innovator. When she formed her own company, Sarah was the kind of woman that would go out and, for props, she'd shop at Tiffany's. I mean, so it got out of control. She started bankrupting the company, doing things the way she wanted them. She did them her way, like Sinatra did things his way. Sarah Caldwell, a real genius. She retired, and that company morphed into the Boston Lyric Opera Company, which is still around. They're doing some wonderful, innovative productions. They're doing an opera you should try to see. It's called Champion, and it's an opera that went to the Met. It's going to be at the Met this season. It's about a prize fighter named Emil Griffin, who was a gay man who fought in the ring and killed a boxer. He was tormented for the rest of his life, and he died a drug addict. It's now an opera by Terence Blanchard, and it's one of the first operas by a black composer to be presented at the Metropolitan Opera. I saw a preview of it. It's going to be shown in theaters around the world. The Met has HD opera. How many of you have seen high-definition opera? How many of you know about it? Well, you really should check it out. The Met broadcasts their operas live every Saturday during the season in theaters all over America. You can see it locally in Randolph. I believe Dedham has it. Coolidge Corner and Cinema. Coolidge Corner. You just check out in the newspaper or go to your computer and go Met HD Opera and check out the complete schedule. Not just Champion, but you'll see all these great operas that they have this season. Madame Butterfly is back. I think Don Giovanni. And you go there and you sit and you are back in the Metropolitan Opera House. They take you backstage, they interview the artists, they tell you the story, and it really is a great way to discover opera. And don't be intimidated by opera. There are no excuses now for I don't understand it, because the translations are there. So let opera come to you. You will fall in love with opera if you let it come to you. Don't put up the barriers, the language barrier. Listen to the great artists that sing it. And they're as handsome and as beautiful today as any movie actor or actress is. I mean, the sopranos look like Liz Taylor. The men look like Richard Burton. I mean, you know. No, not Richard Burton. What's his name? Michael Clooney. George Clooney. Yeah, so you have no excuses, you know. That whole line, it's not over till the fat lady sings. They're all gorgeous women that sing it. So check it out. HD, Met HD Opera. Okay? That's your assignment.
All right, so let's see a hand. Who wants to ask the next question of Ron? Come on now. As you can see and hear, he is an encyclopedia of music. Oh, I see a hand. Here we go.
I've always been fascinated by the story of the origins of jazz.
The origin of jazz.
And I'm wondering if you could tell us your version of how jazz got started and what ignited jazz for this.
Yeah, that could take me a whole day, but basically, it has elements of European classical music. It has elements of gospel music, spiritual, Creole music. Caribbean is involved there. Louisiana marching bands. The assimilation, the cross-pollination of all of those things went into the creation of jazz, particularly the blues singer from the Mississippi Delta. Can you imagine? It's kind of like the United States of music, really. We like to refer to it as America's classical music because there's so many American elements in it, in addition to the elements of the European composers. You know, a lot of the jazz musicians who started in New Orleans quote lines from opera and also symphonies if you listen to their improvisations. That's what Louis Armstrong developed with King Oliver and all those early jazz musicians from New Orleans. New Orleans being, you know, where it all sort of incubated and started, then moved up the river, the Mississippi River, to Chicago. Chicago developed its own sound of jazz. It had its own style, then headed over to New York City. So you have this wonderful pollination of all these different elements that went in to make jazz what it is, pure American classical music. And it has to swing too. And swing is something that was developed by the big bands. Duke Ellington, Count Basie, the Glenn Miller Orchestra, all of those bands contributed to the swing era from 1935 to 1945, when everybody in America was dancing to swing music. Big, big influence on our culture. Jazz, swing, big bands, it's all there. It's purely American, and we can be proud of it. Yeah, good question.
Can I ask a follow-up? So Ron, when you were here visiting the first time, thinking about jazz, we were talking about who was the greatest jazz musician. We had a big debate about this. I wondered if you would tell us who your favorite is and why. I said Duke Ellington, by the way.
Well, you heard me expound before on Louis Satchmo Armstrong. Without him, I don't think we would have jazz, or we would have a bastardized version of jazz. Louis seemed to take the best of all of what I'm talking about and put it into what he was saying. Every solo that Louis Armstrong took could be made into a kind of a musical sculpture. And to this day, musicians all over the world quote him and what he was doing in his improvisations in their own work. As a composer, as a performer, as a great entertainer. You know, Louis Armstrong went over to Europe, went over to Russia and toured, and he was our greatest ambassador of jazz. He started that whole thing during when the Russians had the Iron Curtain. You know, the Russians hated jazz, the communists, because they felt it expressed too much freedom. It was improvisation. It always changed. If you hear a jazz musician playing the St. Louis Blues, different jazz musicians, you're never going to hear it played the same way twice. But you'll always hear Louis Armstrong's version once. And so it basically all came out of this one man, and then all the follow-ups, people who emulated him and followed him. And there are many of those people too. Every jazz musician who followed in jazz, every one of them just about, without anyone else, can follow Louis Armstrong as their leader. So that's how big he was, and that's why Ken Burns, in his PBS Jazz series, you may have seen, devoted so much of it to Louis Armstrong. If you watch the man and just see what he was doing, you'll know what I mean. So he's definitely my choice for Mount Rushmore #1.
Ron, let's just for a moment stay on this topic of the influences of music as an instrument of social justice. And one of my favorite musicians is Frank Sinatra, and what he did as a performing artist in breaking down doors and color barriers and allowing other musicians to perform with him in venues that have been historically prohibited. Of course, we know all about Sammy Davis Jr., but one of the things that I admired most about Frank Sinatra is when he would go into a particular city to perform, he would reach out and look for local musicians and musicians of color to play background in his works.
Yeah.
You want to share some of your reflections about that?
Yeah, I will, and you know, I can also tell you about the Cotton Club in Harlem, where Duke Ellington, Cab Calloway played in their bands, and you know, when you think about it, the Cotton Club produced some of the greatest jazz in America, but it was jazz for whites only, because the Cotton Club did not admit black people to be admitted as patrons in the Cotton Club. It was a segregated club. So here you have all these great bands, Duke Ellington, Cab Calloway, all these singers, Ella Fitzgerald, Billie Holiday, all performing, and yet their friends could not get in as patrons. So these are the kind of things that were instilled in Sinatra as a young person to fight this kind of racism in America, and he continued to do that. Even Las Vegas in the 60s was segregated. White people couldn't, musicians couldn't stay, black people in Las Vegas couldn't stay in white motels around the area. They had to go out of the community to find places to live with their colleagues and musicians. That happened, and Frank Sinatra, of course, he battled that. He said, if they can't come to Las Vegas, downtown Vegas, my black friends and musicians, then I'm not going to perform in clubs here. So this all went on, and finally, you know, thankfully for all of us, it changed. But Sinatra always was in the fight to end for civil rights. He made a documentary called "The House I Live In," which was a battle against intolerance. You probably have seen it. It's about 6 minutes long, and he won a Special Academy Award for it, where he's talking to a bunch of kids, and he explains to those kids how we're all equal. It's not the color of their skin that matters, but it's how you develop your friendships, how you love everybody. And that went on to win a documentary, his first Academy Award, before he won Maggio from Here to Eternity. But how he changed the American songbook was the fact that Sinatra had a sound that was so unique that he sounded like he was singing to you directly. When he sang the song, he sang it from his heart, put the poetry back into the lyrics, and also could sing a ballad beautifully, quiet ballads, or when he could swing, he could really swing. And he loved working with jazz musicians who were like Basie and Ellington, who inspired him to go to even greater heights. So yeah, he changed, like Louis Armstrong, he changed the American songbook forever. As did Tony Bennett. I don't want to leave Tony out of this because Sinatra said Tony Bennett was his favorite singer. And Tony continued to sing. You know, he has Alzheimer's disease, and he gave his farewell concert in Radio City a couple of years ago. My wife and I were there, thousands of people, and after every number, he had a standing ovation. All those lyrics, that music came back to him. It was like he was going through a catharsis. The audience could feel it, he could feel it, and Lady Gaga just inspired him to tune in one of his greatest performances. He's now 97 years old, but that was one of the most historic concerts in history. And what a pleasure to be there, see it. Yeah.
Other questions? I see a hand up over here.
Yes, I read your book.
Here we go.
Reading your book.
Hold on.
It's a very good book. Radio My Way.
Yes.
And following up on to this gentleman's comment, could you discuss something about jazz? I'm learning about it through reading the personalities that you speak about in your book, because
Yes.
you have little biographies at the end, which are, first of all, let me compliment you on how positive they are. You certainly were wonderful about Frank Sinatra Jr. I had a whole different take on him. Not that I know a lot about him, but I certainly enjoyed the way you presented him. But so you kind of touch on this history of how did jazz begin, or the history of jazz. So you have the swing. So bring me through it, because you mentioned the swing bands. Then you say, well, and this is where bebop started, which, yeah, like, what's that? Then you talk about, well, because this is about personalities, it's not about the history of jazz, but if you could just orient me a little bit, how that all morphed. You have the swing bands, you have the bebop, you have the Great American Songbook, and exactly what is that? I mean, I see it. I see all the songs. It seems like it's a whole compendium of songs. But what is it actually? So thank you.
How it all came together? I think because of what we are, you know, that if you give it a chance and open your ears to listen to how all these things did come together, you can kind of sense it. I mean, the bebop thing you're talking about, that's another part of jazz. The film era too, which I'm a part of, we didn't even talk about, but that's another great part of Americana in film music. Look at John Williams, I mean, what John Williams did. There's a good example of an assimilation of all kinds of musical inputs from John Williams' background. Started as a jazz pianist, went into writing jazz scores, composed music for jazz films, conducted the Boston Symphony, conducted the Boston Pops, won more Academy Awards than anybody else for his film scores. He's now 95 years old, or 90 years old, just celebrated his 90th anniversary, and he continues to write. He continues, but he is kind of a symbol of what you're talking about. There's nothing that he left uncovered musically. John Williams, there's not a country in the world where you won't hear a John Williams piece. Star Wars, E.T., Raiders of the Lost Ark, Schindler's List, on and on and on. And he continues to compose. So I think he's a good example of what you're trying to talk about. Bebop, he played bebop. And you know, that's the beauty of being in America. We have so many things that we can discover, and so much of it is in our music, forever.
It was mentioned, Ron's book, Radio My Way, and he did bring a few copies with him, so don't let him get away if you want to try to get one and get him to autograph it for you. So that's a plug for your book, Ron. Just want to put it out there. Other questions? Let me see some hands. Come on now, don't be shy. Here we go. All right.
And right here.
I have always understood that Count Basie was very good on the Hammond B3
Yes.
organ,
Yes.
but I have never heard it in his music. Am I right that he did?
You are absolutely right, and there's some wonderful recordings on Basie playing the Hammond 3 organ. All on, you can get them on CD, and they're marvelous. I listen to Basie a lot because I like to take a walk, and Basie is great for walking because the syncopation and the beat in that band. By the way, Fats Waller also played organ. Did you know that?
Oh, no, I didn't.
He's a great organ player. Jimmy Smith, organ is a big part of jazz, and there's some great recordings. So yeah, Basie at the organ, it's a great sound.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Don't be shy. Come on now.
This is great, doing this. Thank you for
Ron,
Q&A.
before I let you off the hook, let's look forward. Remember when we first sat with Robert and we were having a conversation about how to do this and what made sense, how to make it interactive in a way that for those who are not musicians, and I am not a musician, but I love the music, and how can I, as an adult, appreciate this genre going forward? So my question to you is, you know so many musicians. Which ones come to mind that you would love to see sitting up here on the stage sharing their reflections like you have with us today? Name a couple.
I say Tony Bennett. Every time I've been with Tony Bennett, and we developed a wonderful relationship over the past 40 years, everything Tony said, I wish he had written down. His love for not just music, but humanity. If Tony Bennett hadn't sung a note, he would have been a great artist. His paintings are now in the Smithsonian. They're in the Caldwell Gallery in Ohio. he's a Renaissance man. I can picture Tony Bennett in Italy working as an assistant to Michelangelo, for example. When we talk on the phone, it wouldn't so much be about music, it'd be about the arts and how great life was, and how you can feel that in Tony. If you listen to Tony sing, this is not to discount what I said about Sinatra. Tony Bennett gives you a whole other feeling. There's a tear in Tony's voice. There's an emotion in it that can make you cry. Not that Frank can't make you cry certain times when he sings a ballad, but there's something about Tony Bennett. There's a song he recorded called Where Do You Start? And it's about people we've all known in life that we have loved, past relationships, where it ends. The beginning is the end of it. Where do you start when it's gone and it's broken up? And the lyrics of that song is by Johnny Mandel, who wrote Shadow of Your Smile. And I defy you to listen to that song and not at the end relate to it. It takes you through the breakup of a romance, whose books are yours, whose tapes and music are yours. Then he goes on to sing, and yet there'll always be a special place that nobody else will see, that'll be hidden away in my heart, that just you and I will know. I mean, you know, and you listen to that, I pull off the road when I hear that. That's another thing about the power of music. And that's why I think so many of you are here, because you believe in what Robert and people here are doing. I mean, there were moments in Symphony Hall, and I did about 2,000 live broadcasts in Symphony Hall over 35 years. Live, every Saturday night, in Tanglewood, every Sunday afternoon and Saturday night. I heard some of the most greatest artists in my mind, in my world, that I will ever, and in your world or anybody's world who likes this music will hear. I heard them do so many remarkable things. It was hard for me sometimes to not cry or be emotionally involved when I got off the air. I'd want to go up to people in Symphony Hall in the street and say, did you hear what went on in this hall just behind me? I was so involved in the music. I had performances of symphonies and Shostakovich and Beethoven and Mahler and Berlioz and Stravinsky and Debussy and Ravel and Stravinsky and on and on and on, that you hear and you say, what are you missing? You're missing this. You can't miss this. Life is too short to miss this. Get into the hall and hear what's going on and escape into this world for 2 hours or 3 hours. But you won't be disappointed. You'll come out changed. You'll come out spiritually uplifted. Any problems that you have and you're going through, and they can be serious and tough for all of us, for those few moments, you're captured by the musicians and the conductors and the artists that are doing that for you. So that's why it's all important we support what's going on here too, Robert. And you're doing a fabulous job with your staff.
We were going to ask you, Ron, to expand a bit on the importance of music education. Yes. And the great work that's going on here at the Conservatory.
Yeah, and I think I pretty much covered that when I said the little toddlers leaving. I mean, how wonderful is that to see them with their parents coming out of this place. And you know, maybe later on, maybe in 2 or 3 years, they'll be listening to Beethoven, they'll be going to a symphony concert, they'll be listening to the great masters, the great musicians that make the music. And it has to be brought down to their level more and more, I think, because the more they get it, they're going to be assaulted with cacophony and noise when they get out into the real world. How many of you go to a restaurant where you can talk to people across from you and hear yourself? We're losing our sense of hearing. I mean, the young people's hearing, a lot of them shattered because the decibel level is so loud. You know, where is there a quiet place? Quiet places are in musical institutions, Symphony Hall, the chamber music, opera houses. Those are the quiet places. Those are the places when you can really hear and experience what's going on. Not in a room that's so loud that you can't talk and you have to leave because your ears are sore. You know, I don't mean to preach here, but I am. You know, A man wrote a book called Alex Ross about, he's a musicologist, a wonderful book. He calls it The Rest is Noise. The Rest is Noise. Great book. Right, Robin, you read it?
Yeah, I actually heard him speak live a couple of years ago.
Yeah, he just wrote a book on Wagner. It's like 1,000 pages.
I haven't read that one.
Every time you go to a movie, by the way, and you hear a musical score, and the old movies too, and my wife and I are movie buffs, we watch a lot of old film noir classics, you will hear great scores by these film composers. You mentioned John Williams, but Dmitri Tiomkin, Max Steiner, the great composer who did, Bernard Herrmann, who did Psycho. All of these composers worshipped one God, and that God was Wagner, because Wagner changed composition and film music forever by his developing of the thing he called the leitmotif, attaching themes for characters, places, things, and objects. And every movie you see from Star Wars on has that Wagner connection. And that's basically what his book is about. He gets into the real depth analysis about it, but yeah.
Now, you spoke earlier about Tony Bennett, who unfortunately most likely would not be available to come sit with us. However, one of his musicians lives in this area, who has played with Tony for over 25 years and performed right here at the Conservatory. You know who I'm talking about?
I do.
So do you think we could get him to come on out here and sit
So
with
that
us
would be
for an
great. We
afternoon?
could do a Tony Bennett. Well, half his group lives up here. Gray Sargent lives up in Hull, and Marshall Wood, his bass player, lives down in Norwell. So we have half the quartet there, you know, but that'd be nice to have a jazz night here.
Naomi, you finally got a question?
Hey, Naomi. How are you, Naomi? Good.
A few years ago, you did an interview with Tony's two musicians, Gray Sargent.
I did.
You did that. You did that.
On Hull TV.
And Hull TV was 1 hour,
Yeah.
20 minutes in the middle of the afternoon.
Yeah.
You sat there mesmerized. How did you get those two to do the interview? And going forward, because Tony always sang music for everyone. Today, you talk about restaurants and noise.
Yeah.
The music, all you need to know is one note and you got it down pat. So
That's good.
just give me an idea about that interview because I learned so much about them. I saw Gray not too long ago at the 51 Walden in Concord, and he's playing in a jazz club in Hyannis. So how did you get that interview together? And you learned so much more about Tony, who was truly an amazing man. Tell me a little bit about that.
The interview happened because I've known Marshall and Gray for years. You know, I've known, and Gray's wife, Pam, her father was the great Dick Johnson. And Marshall Wood is married to Donna Byrne, great singer. You know, musicians never forget people that did things for them. So I guess my connection in radio, promoting their music for the years, gave me an inside track. Also the fact that I had known Tony so well. That's how my relationship with my wife's relationship with Tony developed. But then when I asked them to do that, there was no question. They just said, we'll come by. How long do you want it? And I said, as long as you want to play. And they're still showing that occasionally, right? They go into the archives and show it. Yeah. It was a good interview, two of them. I'm glad. I'd like to do it again sometime.
Just hearing the two of them play
Oh,
was miraculous.
absolutely. It was, yeah, it was beautiful.
One thing that Gray had said to me 3-4 weeks ago, I'm glad I don't have to travel around the world anymore.
Yeah, they traveled everywhere around the world. Well, Tony was popular everywhere, you know, just like Sinatra. Great ambassador of our music, American songbook.
Ron, what are you doing now to stay active? You've got something planned coming up in February. Tell us about
Yeah,
it.
we're doing a Frank Sinatra dance party, and it started at Raphael's South Shore Country Club in Hingham. We do several of these, and it's nice. It's young people that like the music, like we all do, who come down, but the focus is the people who like to dance. I mean, and we cross all age groups. There are people there from, 20s all the way up through the 80s, and come and they dance and they listen to great band. We got a great band, Rico Barr and his band. They do everything from Tony Bennett to Sinatra to Louis Prima to Nat Cole to all the music. And it's a fun thing. It's February 17th, the day before my birthday.
Which is to say, it's also on the occasion of his 85th birthday coming up. Well, this concludes our afternoon conversation with Ron Della Chiesa. We want to thank you all very much for coming out and supporting this cutting-edge work, as I'd like to see it here at the South Shore Conservatory. So let's give Ron a final good round of applause.
Thank you very much.